Hi there, and welcome to the Salted Pepper, where we cook for real life using real food and we keep it real simple. And today we are going to make a red velvet bundt cake with a peppermint ganache. And this is a perfect cake for the wintertime, or really any time, because it is absolutely beautiful and absolutely delicious. So I don't usually like red velvet cakes. Number one, I don't like to use food coloring. Usually when I'm cooking, I try to keep things as natural as I can, so I don't use a lot of food coloring. But people love red velvet cakes, so I thought that I would do a recipe. This one turned out so fantastic that I even love it, and you can either use the red food coloring or not. That is totally optional. It is not necessary in the recipe. So the first thing I want to talk about real quick is what is the difference between a red velvet cake and a regular chocolate cake? And honestly, I didn't know. I thought it was just simply the food coloring. But I did some research and I found out that it is the use of buttermilk along with baking soda and vinegar. And that apparently creates this reaction that turns the chocolate cake kind of a reddish color. However, it wasn't red enough or maroon enough for most people, so then they started adding in food coloring to really bump up that red color. And that is why you can still call this a red velvet cake even if you skip the food coloring. It just won't be as dark of a red. And my cake actually is not going to give you that really light red color that you see in so many of the red velvet cakes. Mine is definitely a deeper maroon color, and that's because I add in some extra chocolate chips. And this makes this cake super moist, so delicious, and really chocolatey in flavor. So don't let all these ingredients intimidate you either, because this cake comes together so fast, it is so easy, and you don't even need a hand mixer. Okay, so we're gonna get started and we're gonna put in the buttermilk. This is 1/2 of a cup of buttermilk. If you don't have buttermilk and you have regular milk, you can use 1 cup of regular milk with 1 tablespoon of vinegar and let it sit, and you'll see it start to curdle, and you can make your own buttermilk. You can also skip the buttermilk and you can make this recipe with half and half or heavy cream. I have tested it with heavy cream and it works just fine. All right, so let's heat up the buttermilk just a little bit. So we're gonna go on the sear saute, but I'm gonna take this down to a medium or low medium. And we're just gonna let it heat up just a little bit, and then we're gonna pop in our chocolate chips to get those melted. I also have here 1.5 teaspoons of instant espresso coffee. And this is just like, you can buy it at the grocery store. They're little granules, kind of like instant coffee. And you could use instant coffee too if you couldn't find the espresso. What I find is that this really boosts that chocolatey flavor. It doesn't taste like coffee. So even if you're not a coffee lover, you don't have to worry about that. It just makes the chocolate flavor enhanced. Now, it's not a necessity. If you don't have it, can't find it, or don't want to use it, just skip it. It's not going to affect the outcome of the cake. It just boosts the flavor of the chocolate. All right, so once this heats up just a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and get all of this buttermilk out here, out of this bowl. Once it heats up just a little bit, then we will add in our chocolate chips, and we'll just let the chocolate chips sit in the pot while we get our dry ingredients together. All right, so I see the buttermilk is kind of separating there. It is definitely hot enough. Turn the Ninja Foodi off. Add in the chocolate chips. Add in your espresso powder if you're using that, and give it a nice little stir. Then we will just let it sit. It doesn't look very pretty. Don't worry about that, okay? All right. You don't even have to worry about all the chocolate chips getting melted. They'll melt from the residual heat, no problem whatsoever. All right, now we're just gonna let that sit because we want it to cool off some before we mix it in with our other wet ingredients. You can even pop the inner pot out if you want. It'll cool off a little bit faster. But I'm not gonna worry about that because things take a little bit longer when you're doing a video anyway, so it'll be cool by the time we're ready for it. All right, so now I have a mixing bowl with a fine sieve strainer. This is what I use to sift my flour. Sifting the flour and the cocoa powder I think is important in this recipe. It's just gonna put more air into the flour, and since we're gonna pressure cook this cake, which I'll talk about in a few minutes because I know a lot of people are against pressure cooking cakes, and it really depends on the recipe. This one turns out really well pressure cooked. Some turn out pretty dense and they're not that great pressure cooked, but this one is good for pressure cooking, I promise. But you could also bake it, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So I am gonna definitely sift the flour because I wanna give as much help as I can to create a nice light crumb on this cake. And since we're going to be cooking it in a moist environment under pressure, sifting the flour, I think, has helped. I didn't sift it in one test, and I sifted it in another, and I thought the result was better. So I think that it is worth the time to do this, but it's not going to ruin your cake if you don't, okay? This is 1 3/4 cup of all-purpose flour and 1½ tablespoons of unsweetened cocoa. I get the Ghirardelli kind because that's the chocolate that I prefer, but you can use any unsweetened cocoa that you want. So Hershey's, anything like that. You could even use a dark cocoa, but if you did, just know your cake's it's going to be darker. It's not even going to be as maroon as mine is. It's going to be darker. And then I just take this little whisk here and just whisk this in, and you can see it's just coming out in a nice, fine flour. Now I also I don't add in my salt because this is a fine grind sea salt and it's a 1/2 teaspoon, but it won't fit through my little strainer, so it would just be stuck in the bottom. So I don't add that in until the end. What I have here too is 1 teaspoon of baking soda and 1 teaspoon of baking powder. And I'm going to talk about that for just a second. You could get away with just using the baking soda in this recipe because it's going to be activated by the vinegar we use, and it is going to give you some of your lift and leavening in this cake, which means your rise. However, when I just did it with the baking soda, I did not think it rose enough to give a lighter kind of a cake feel. So this is going to be kind of like a really moist baked cake. So I added in the teaspoon of baking powder, and that seemed to do the trick. So that's what I'm using, but you don't have to. You can use just the teaspoon of baking soda if you don't have baking powder. This is why it's a good reason to also sift your cocoa powder, because I've got little bits here that really need to be broken up, and I can do that with my whisk. And then when they go in, they are going in as a really fine powder. I prefer this method of using a fine sift strainer over some of those handheld ones. I just don't like them. They're a pain to clean, if you ask me. All right, that looks good. There's a few little ones left. I'm not even going to worry about that. That looks good. All right, I'll set that over there for right now. And then I just put in my salt and just kind of give it a little mix. All right, that is all for our dry ingredients. So we can set those over here. See how our chocolate is doing. Looks pretty good. All right, so now we're gonna get our wet ingredients. And how I do this is I'm using a mixing bowl that's also got a little spout on it. I find this easier than transferring from a bowl like this into a Bundt pan. So now I can just pour it in. It's gonna just make it a little bit easier. But you can use any mixing bowl you'd like to do this. That's no problem at all. And I'm gonna start off with my 2 eggs. So these are 2 large eggs. And we're gonna use a half of a cup of vegetable oil or canola oil, whichever you prefer. You could probably use almost any kind of oil, but you don't wanna use butter in this recipe. It will change the texture, so I don't advise you do that. And just give those a little whisk. And we'll add in the sugar next. This is 1 cup of just white sugar. One teaspoon of vanilla extract. Now, let me talk about that for a second. You could use a peppermint extract if you wanted to give a little peppermint flavor to the cake itself, but I chose not to do that. I wanted the cake to be chocolate. And I'm gonna put in these little peppermint Hershey Kisses that I've chopped up. I'm gonna put those into the cake batter. So you'll get little pieces of peppermint, but your cake batter itself is just chocolate. And that's how I prefer it. But if you want a more pepperminty flavor, definitely add in some extract. Skip the vanilla and add in 1 teaspoon of peppermint extract, and that'll do that for you. All right, the last thing we add to this is gonna be our chocolate mixture. Just wanna make sure that it is, let me use this, that it is not too hot. Nope, it's good. Okay, so I just wanna make sure, because you don't wanna pour a hot chocolate into an egg mixture right away and have it start to cook and curdle the eggs. So let me grab some hand mitt so I can pick, actually, I can pick the pot up. It's not even hot. Oh, that's wonderful. Saves a step, right? And I'm just gonna pour this chocolate in. And as I pour it in, I'm just gonna continually whisk while I pour it in. It's also gonna help cool off the chocolate and have it not cook the egg mixture. All right, that looks good. All right, now before we combine the two, the wet ingredients with the dry ingredients, I want to get the pan ready and talk about the pan I'm going to use. So for this recipe, I am using a Pampered Chef Bundt pan that is about 7.5 to 7 3/4 in diameter. It is a 3-cup Bundt pan. So any Bundt pan that you have at home is gonna work just fine as long as it's a 3 or 4 cup capacity. If it's a 4-cup capacity, you're just not gonna have as tall of a cake. So you might need to adjust your cooking times, and I will get into that in the written post on my website. I'll go over various different pans that you could use and my suggestions. I have not tested this recipe in every pan that you could possibly have, but I did test it about 7 times in different pans, so I think I have a pretty good idea of how it's gonna cook for you. But this Bundt pan, I loved the look of it, and it's a very heavy duty. It's a great quality. So if you don't have a Bundt pan and you want to pick it up, I will link to that below. This is from Pampered Chef, but it is 3 cups and it is about 7.5, 7 3/4 in diameter. The other pan that I know is very popular, and I just did a banana bread recipe with a praline topping in it, which I will link to right up there, is this cute little flour pan. Now, I have been working for the past couple days to develop a batter that will just fill this perfectly. So I wanted to actually give you 2 recipes so that you could use the exact amount of ingredients, but I haven't gotten it right yet. So when I start to decrease ingredients, because we have to drop from 2 to 1 egg. Anyway, it gets complicated. So it hasn't worked. It's risen up too much. I need to play with it some more. So for now, if you want to make this in the flour pan, use this same recipe, but do not fill the pan all the way. If you fill the pan all the way, because this will fit all of this batter, but it will be way up to the top. You will end up rising up and it will be spilling over into the inner pot of the Ninja Foodi, and it's just gonna make a big mess. So go 2/3 of the way up to the top with the batter, and then whatever you have left over, make little cake bites or something like that. You know, you could do anything like that you want. So the flour pan, and I'll have those written instructions in my post on my website as well. To prepare this pan, I'm gonna go ahead and butter it. Now you could spray it with your favorite oil, or you could use even a pan grease, which I usually do, but I don't have any made up, and I haven't had any made up in quite some time. So I'm just gonna use butter, and that's gonna work fine. The easiest way I find to do that is with a little silicone brush. Well, this butter, it's cold in our house, so this butter's a little on the stiff side, but it'll be fine. And I'm just gonna go in with the brush and butter all around the cake pan. This just helps with it releasing at the end. You don't need to flour it though. In fact, I don't think I would. Sometimes the flour will leave little gumminess, especially when you're going under pressure and you're in a moist environment. So I would not recommend flouring it, just the butter. Or spray it. I make sure that I get into the center too here, so I go all the way up the little center of the Bundt pan. All right, that looks good. Now, when I was getting my butter, I realized that I had forgotten to add in my vinegar, which is very important in a red velvet cake. And it's very important when you're adding baking soda because it's gonna give the acid, although the buttermilk's also the acid. So I think it would probably be fine if I forgot it, but it is important. So 1.5 teaspoons of just white vinegar. This in there. All right, so now we are about to combine these two and get them in our pan and get it under pressure. But first, let me quick rinse out this pot. You don't want to go under pressure with the chocolate in there. I mean, it's not going to ruin anything, but it's just going to be kind of messy. So I'm going to go ahead and clean out the pot, and then we will get this cake finished up and under pressure. All right, so let's add in the food coloring. I am gonna use it in this recipe, but remember, you do not need to do this. It is just an additional step to kind of boost the color of the red. And I'm using 1 tablespoon. There's 2 tablespoons in this jar. I'm using 1 tablespoon. I don't care that it's not a real light red. In fact, I don't think it's going to be a light red with the chocolate that we put in. So that doesn't matter to me, but I will add it in. It's a beautiful color. It turns really like deep maroon, and it looks so gorgeous with the peppermint ganache that we're gonna make. It's just really pretty, so. Ordinarily, though, I'd probably just skip it. If I was just making it not for a special occasion, I'd probably just skip the food coloring. All right, now we're gonna add in the dry ingredients. And this is simple, dump them. You can dump them all in at once. And then just whisk. And it takes no time at all for the dry ingredients to incorporate and thicken up the batter. All right, that's good. And look how beautiful it is. It's a nice, beautiful red. Okay, so let's get it in. Oh, I'm sorry, you know what? I almost forgot to add the one thing that is my little special touch to this. I won't need this whisk anymore, so I'm gonna put that right in there. So what I did was I chopped up about 15 of these little Hershey Kisses, okay? And they're in just little small pieces. You don't want them too big. They tend to bust out of the side of the cake if they're too big. But if they're too small, they're just gonna disappear. So you want them into like little chunks. So each one I usually cut into about 5 or 6 pieces. And this is about 1/2 cup. You could use less, but I would not use any more than 1/2 cup, or you'll have them poking out all over your cake, which doesn't look bad, honestly. I had that happen, but I think this is a good amount. All right, so this cake batter is already starting to rise because of the baking powder and baking soda. So we want to get it in so it does that during the cooking process. And so now I'm just going to pour the batter in. and just kind of go around. I try not to get it to the center, like over top of the center. This is why I like to use this particular bowl. It just makes it a little bit easier. But you could also use a scoop if you wanted to. All right. Now, what I'm doing is I'm going about 2/3 of the way up the side. Maybe a little bit more than that. Now, I also am going to warn you that sometimes this cake will go up above the edge as it cooks. Don't worry about that. It settles back down beautifully, so do not worry. All right, I got a couple little pieces here. I just want to kind of get those off. Everything else looks really good. I'm not going to worry. There's a little bit coming up the little center. I'm not even going to worry about that. No problems at all. Now, before you go under pressure, you definitely want to cover this. You can cover it with foil. If you do that, make sure that you tuck it underneath pretty well. I'm going to use this silicone cover. It's worked really well, but because the cake rises up, I'm going to butter this as well, just to prevent it from sticking. One thing about this cake pan, although I do love it, it's kind of interesting because it comes with a really cool insert that you can put in here that you can actually pick it and lower it in and out of the pot with, and I love that, but you can't get a cover on when you're using that. So that will come in handy during certain times, but for this, we can't use it. And also, this little centerpiece does sit up a little bit more than the outer edges, so I've just noticed that this does allow some moisture in, but not enough to worry about. And I know a lot of people don't like using foil when they cook, so I just wanted to show you guys how this cover does work, and it works well. But foil will work perfect too. We just put it on top, and that's it. And then we're gonna put 1 cup of water into the inner pot and get the rack in the low position. And put this on the rack. It fits really nicely on the rack. All right, and then we're gonna lift it in. And I just like to push it down a little bit on the sides because like I said, that center's a little bit raised up, so I just like to do that. Now we're gonna put our pressure lid on. Make sure that the valve in the back is to the seal position. So we're gonna go under pressure for 28 minutes. So we're gonna go ahead and hit the start button. Pressure, high is what we want. And we're gonna take it up to 28 minutes. And hit the start button. And then we're gonna do a 10-minute natural release and let that cake, hopefully it'll settle down during that natural release time, so you won't be so alarmed when I open the lid and it's like this tall, because it really does rise up quite a bit, but then it settles down. All right, so once this is done and it goes through the 10-minute natural release, we will make our peppermint ganache. All right, so we just have a few more seconds to go of the 10-minute natural release, and it took the pot about 5 minutes to come up to pressure, so that was pretty quick. And then we went under pressure for 28 minutes on high, and now we can release the remaining pressure. I always cross my fingers at this point. No matter how many times I've tested something, you know, there can always be something that goes wrong, right? Let's see. All right. Well, so far so good. Oh boy, here we go. I did one cake test in the flour pan, and when I opened it up, I could tell like everything had like, well, not everything, but a lot of the batter had bubbled out, and I mean, it was fine. It was actually a really good cake. It tasted good. I had to put it under pressure a little bit longer, but it tasted good. All right. So let's pull this out here. And like I said, you see how it's risen above? That is fine. Don't worry about it. Now, it's gonna seem kind of odd, but I'm gonna leave this alone for a few minutes before I even lift this up. And that is because I have found that it just needs to sit. and we're gonna make our ganache anyway. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna move it off this rack, and I'm just gonna put it over here. I'm not even gonna move the lid or worry about getting the liquid off the top. I'm gonna let it just kind of cool just as it is. We can turn the Ninja Foodi off now, and I'm gonna dump this pot and dry it out. It's important that you start with a dry pot when we make the ganache, okay? So let me get that done. All right, so I cleaned the pot out, and it is still hot. So as soon as I put these chocolate melting wafers in, it's going to start to melt them. So I haven't even turned the Ninja Foodi on yet, but I will. So that was 1 cup of white melting chocolate. That is what I'm using. That's what I had here. You could use chocolate chips, or you could use a block of white chocolate and just cut it up. So anything's fine for this recipe. So we're gonna turn the Ninja Foodi on. We wanna go to the sear saute, but we wanna take it down to a low medium and let the chocolate chips start to melt. And it's gonna happen pretty fast. You wanna do this over a low heat. You don't wanna overheat your chocolate. Now these are a little bit easier to deal with, I find, because they are melting chocolate and not just, like a bar of chocolate or a block of chocolate. All right, so all of the chocolate is almost melted here. What I'm using is a silicone coated whisk. If you don't have one that is safe for the inner pot of the Ninja Foodi, you could use a scraper as well. That would work just fine. All right, that looks good. Now I'm gonna turn the Ninja Foodi off, and we're gonna pour in 1/3 cup of heavy whipping cream. And it is important, you do need to use heavy whipping cream for this to work out. And the ratio amounts for a white chocolate ganache is going to be 1 cup to 1/3 cup. So for every cup of white chocolate you use, you're gonna use 1/3 of whipping cream. I'm gonna go ahead and remove this and kind of tilt it. I guess I could try to tilt it towards you. And just sort of blend it all in. Once it's blended in, I'm gonna add in my peppermint extract. Let me just move this here. It's gonna be very runny, okay? Don't worry about that. We also have to let this cool down. That's why I make it now, because by the time the cake is ready to be glazed, our ganache will be thicker. You don't want it to be so thin that it runs off the cake, but you don't want it to be so thick that you can't pour it either. So it's kind of a little balance, but we're gonna get it perfect, and it's real easy. And if for some reason you let it cool too much, you can always reheat it and then let it cool to the desired consistency you want. What I'm using to flavor my peppermint ganache is peppermint emulsion, okay? This is a bakery emulsion. I prefer to use these over extracts, but you could use a peppermint extract as well. And if you didn't want a peppermint flavor, you could add whatever flavor you wanted to this, and it would be perfectly delicious. All right, so you can add 1 to 2 teaspoons. I found that 2 gives that really strong, nice peppermint flavor that I want. And then I'm just gonna whisk this up. And it's not gonna seize your chocolate. You know, sometimes when we flavor chocolate, it gets seized up, and it's not going to do that because we have the heavy cream in there, so we're protected from that. And that's what makes this type of a glaze so easy. All right, that looks great. And now I will just pour it into our bowl so that it can cool along with our cake. And I will unveil the cake for you now too, because it's sad enough, and we will get it flipped over onto our cooling rack so it can cool completely. All right, so let's scrape this out. Now, if we tried to pour this over top of our cake right now, it would just run off. It's way too thin, and also our cake is hot, so you definitely need to let both the ganache and cake cool, and the cake needs to cool completely. All right, looks good. Now, we may not use all of this ganache, and if you don't use it all, what you can do with the leftovers is get a little pan, mix some more candy canes or the soft peppermint, which is what I'm gonna use, mix it in and let it set up, and you'll have like a little fudge. Or you can make truffles out of this. This would be exactly how you would make a truffle. I would probably make them just a little bit thicker maybe, but this would be a good one that cools down completely. You'll be able to roll it into a truffle and then roll it in peppermint pieces, and that would be kind of cool too. So we'll see how much is left over, and if there's enough left over, I'll show you how to do that. All right, are we ready for the big unveiling of the cake? Now it's still hot, but look, it came out perfectly. Now, when I took this out first, it was raised up, especially on this side, it was raised up a good 1/2 inch. And that's why I leave it covered and I let it sit. Now this is still really hot, like I couldn't just pick this up. So I let it sit for a while. Now I'm gonna take my cake tester and I'm gonna go down and sort of separate it out a little bit, and we're gonna turn it upside down on our cooling rack. And I do recommend that you cool it out of the pan, but you want to let it sit for a few minutes, at least 10 minutes before you put it over onto your rack. And I'm going to show you a really easy way to put it onto the cooling rack. So when you can comfortably hold this pan in your hands for just a few seconds to a minute, it has cooled enough in the pan, and now we can flip it. But before I do that, I almost always use a cake tester to sort of go around the edges and just see, is there anything that's stuck? And it doesn't look like it so far, but I just kind of carefully pull back these edges just to see, because you don't want anything to stick. You want it to come out nice and smooth, but it looks like it's bouncing back. And as the cake cools, it pulls away from the pan. Well, certain cakes anyway, some don't, but this one does. So it pulls back, so looks like we're good to go. So I am gonna go ahead and get my cooling rack up here. This is how I flip a cake. Put the cooling rack on top and then flip. And of course I try to put it on a steady surface here. All right, and now, this again is always the moment of truth. If you go to lift it and it's not quite lifting up, leave it alone. Don't force it, okay? It will lift up as it cools and gravity pulls the cake down to the cooling rack, it is going to loosen this up. So if I can't pull it straight up, I don't mess with it. I just will leave it like this for a few minutes so that everything sort of loosens up in there and gravity drops it down. Not quite, we're not ready. So I'm just gonna set it over here, let it cool for 5 minutes like that, and then I'll try again. And I encourage you to be patient with this part. This is probably the most important part of getting a cake out of a pan, is being patient enough to wait until it's ready to be released so you don't have it stick to your pan. All right, so I've let it just cool just a minute or so, and it kind of fell down, like I could see it fall down a little bit. So now I'm gonna carefully just lift this up. If you meet resistance, stop and let it sit longer. But it should just lift up. And it did. Ooh, it's so pretty. It's so pretty. I love the way you can see the peppermint Hershey Kisses coming out, poking out a little bit. I love this cake. Okay, so now it still has to cool though, because it's still hot. So it has to be totally cool or the glaze will not stick, the ganache will not stick. So you could either put it in the refrigerator or just leave it on your counter till it cools, whatever you prefer to do. I'm gonna just set it over here for now. I already have my pan prepared for doing the ganache, doing the icing. And that's with a little bit of parchment paper. That's a good idea because as you pour the ganache over, it's gonna spill down through all these holes, and you can just scrape it right back up off of the parchment paper and do it again. So that's how I do it. Now let me talk about the topping that's gonna go on the very top, the peppermint candies. Because a lot of you might think that they're candy canes, but they're actually not candy canes. Now you could use candy canes, but candy canes are gonna be crunchy. These are called soft peppermint candy. And they are little sticks, and I found them at the dollar store. To be honest, I didn't even know that they were soft peppermint at the time. Now, when I say soft, I don't mean like chewy. They're not chewy like that. Let me take one out of the bag here. So they seem like they're hard, but when you actually bite into them, they just sort of melt away. And I thought the texture on top of this cake was perfect with these. But you could use candy canes, or you know what else you could do? If you can't find these or don't have time to get them, you already are gonna have leftover Hershey Kisses. Chop those up and sprinkle those on top. That would be wonderful too. So to do this, to just chop them up into little pieces, I'm gonna use a meat tenderizer from Pampered Chef that I happen to love. It's heavy, and so I use it a lot for this kind of thing. And there's a smooth edge, and then there's the prong edge. So I just have it turned to the smooth edge, and I have it in a little baggie, and I'm just gonna kind of go through this a little bit. I don't want super fine pieces, but I don't want like really huge pieces either. All right, it looks good. All right, so I'm just gonna leave these here until our cake is completely cooled, and then we will finish them up. But in the meantime, remember I said if we had any leftover peppermint ganache, I was gonna show you how to turn those into truffles. So let's get to that real quick, and that way it'll give our cake time to cool, okay? All right, so what I did was I put some of the white chocolate peppermint ganache into a shallow dish, just like this. I'm only gonna make a few. You can make as many as you wanted. You could make up more of the ganache and do a whole dozen of these, it doesn't matter. Then I have a little scoop here. This is the small scoop from Pampered Chef, but it's about a teaspoon, so you could use a teaspoon as well. And this has been refrigerated, so it is definitely colder than the ganache that we have at room temperature. So we're gonna just scoop a little bit out here. It is a little sticky still. It probably could have set up a little bit more than that, so I'm kind of making a mess, but you're gonna get the idea anyway. I should have let it set up just a little bit more. But anyway, you can do this. Now you can mix in, so like let's say that you had a whole thing of ganache. You could mix these little pieces in and then just scoop it and roll it out. But anyway, that is basically all you need to do to make a truffle. Now, I would ordinarily let those set up in the refrigerator overnight to become harder. You know, I mean, a truffle, when you bite into it, it's soft, but it's not sticky like this one is. It just hasn't been in the refrigerator long enough. But I'm gonna taste this anyway, just to let you know how it tastes, even though it is a little bit on the sticky side. But that's how easy it is to make a truffle. So definitely, you can do it with dark chocolate too. The ratio is a little bit different though. Wow, that is good. That would be so good if it was set up right. I definitely, absolutely would not roll these in candy canes unless it was really fine. You don't want big chunks of the candy cane. This was perfect because it wasn't like, brittle, that kind of thing. It was soft and it just sort of melted away. But definitely, if you want to do candy canes, just crush them really fine and then roll your truffles right in the candy cane dust, so to speak. And they will be fantastic and they'll be absolutely beautiful. So that is how you make a truffle out of ganache. Super, super easy to do. All right, so I'm gonna set this over here. We're gonna let our cake finish cooling, and then we will get it decorated and we will taste it, and we'll see the center too. I hope you can see that it is a nice red color, so I'll be really interested to see how the inside looks. All righty, so it's completely cool to touch now. It's not warm at all, and we can finish up our cake. So the ganache was just a little bit too thick, and I put it in the microwave for just about 10 seconds, and then I let it cool down just a little bit. This is the consistency that you want. You want it to be pourable, but not too runny and not too thick. So just about like that. And you'll know if it's too runny, it's gonna pour right off the cake and it's not gonna stick, and you'll get really thin layers. And just let it cool a little bit more, or put it in the refrigerator for a minute, or put it in a shallower dish because that will cool it off more. Then you can do this a gazillion ways. I mean, you could get a decorating bag and just pipe it on the top. What you wanna do is try to take the icing around the top so that it drips down the sides. I'm just gonna use a spoon though. You kind of put more on than you think you're going to. This actually might be a little on the thicker side too now that I'm watching how it's dripping. Well, nope, it's gonna be good. Probably could have been a little thinner, honestly, a little thinner. It looks nice though, but it's not dripping quite as much as I would have hoped. So let's kind of help it. You know what? I am going to heat this up just a tad bit, just so the remaining bit, and I'm also going to take the rest of it that I took out to do the truffles, and I'm going to heat that with it because it needs to cascade over, and this is just not quite doing the trick. So let me just heat this up, and if you run into this, don't worry about it. Your cake's going to look beautiful, even if it starts out like this, okay? No worries. All right, so I just put it in for about 10 seconds, but I mixed in the cold ganache that was in the refrigerator too, so I had a little bit more to go to do this with. And now let's see, hopefully it is going to work. And the warm ganache going on top of the cooler ganache is actually going to warm that up underneath and create some drips too. And there is no right way or wrong way to do this either. All right, let's let that drip down. I think I need some going down in the center here. All right, it's looking good. Now you could do that as many times as you wanted. So sometimes, especially if it's a little thin, I will put a layer on and it kind of just goes all the way down, and then I'll let it cool, and then I'll do another thicker layer, and it just gives some different dimensions. But however you want to do it, you can't go wrong. I'm telling you, it's just an easy, gorgeous cake. And then I just put these on the top, and if they get carried down the landslide, then so be it. No problems. Now, what I also do is, because, you know, as this cake cools more, well, the cake's cold, but as the ganache cools, especially if you put it in the fridge, it's gonna set up. So what I like to do is put one extra little layer. Then I put a layer of chocolate on top. Not everywhere, but just a little bit, just to sort of seal in these little pieces a little bit more. It looks so pretty. All right. Perfecto. All right. So there we go. I could see the front, so I think the front actually looks a little bit better than, or the back. I could see the back, I couldn't see the front, so I think the back looks a little bit better. So I'll just turn it around like that. I guess I got a landslide going down. That's fine. So now just let it sit. Let this set up a little bit, or you can put it in the refrigerator. That's perfectly fine. And then we will cut it and we will eat it. And I'll let you know how wonderful this cake turned out. I've made about 6 or 7 of them so far, so I pretty much know that they are absolutely delicious. All right, so now it's time to cut the cake. So what I did was I just transferred it over to the cutting board, and I'm going to take a little slice here. I'm so excited about this. And let me get it right there. Now, even though this is a smaller Bundt pan, I mean, it really does give you a good amount of servings. So I would say this would definitely serve at least 10 people easily, probably a little bit more. So it's absolutely gorgeous. It's cooked to perfection, and it is spongy like a cake that is baked should be. So the texture looks absolutely amazing. This is not a real dense cake that sometimes you get when you pressure cook. This looks perfect. It looks like it just came right out of the oven. It's a beautiful color. It's not bright red, but it's a nice dark maroon. It doesn't look just like chocolate. It does look like a red velvet cake. All right, so let's get a little piece down here. It cuts, beautifully. Oh my gosh, I am so excited. This is the best, I think, chocolate cake, red velvet cake I've ever had in my life. The flavor's outstanding, the texture is perfect. Oh my gosh. Let me get some with that peppermint on top. You can see the crumb on this is perfect. It's absolutely perfect. I love my apple cake. And I mean, it's a delicious cake, but it's so totally different. It's a real dense cake. And I can link to that recipe right up there because it is really, really good. And it's another pressure cooked cake. But this one just reminds me like it just came out of the oven. And that's hard to do sometimes in the pressure cooker. So I worked really hard on this recipe, and I sure hope you give it a try. It is so good. All right, I have to take one more bite because you know what I just saw sneaking out there? One of those little pieces of the Hershey Kiss. That right there. That right there was the bite that makes this cake worth making. I cannot wait to hear how you like it. Please leave me a comment when you make it and let me know.